Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to this session, which is titled Agriculture and Food. The first session in the morning, the day after the social dinner, is always a challenge. So thank you very much for being here. We have 3 presentations. The rules, you know how they work. We have 20 minutes for each presentation, and then we have time for discussion with your comments and questions. So the first presentation is given by Silvia Montagnani. Silvia, the floor is yours.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for being here. Buongiorno a tutti, a tutte. Today I will present our work on the carbon legacy of debt and conflict. I'm Silvia Montagnani, and I am a PhD student in a co-tutel program in between France and Germany, in between economics and climate physics. Often people ask me why you pursue such an interdisciplinary path. And I always reply with this graph that I find pretty interesting, because we are living in a time of polycrisis. What does it mean? We are living in a time in which multiple crises interact and are compounding, and several of their impacts are cascading. So there are multiple interactions in between economic, environmental, and geopolitical spheres. For this reason, it's necessary to have a kind of interdisciplinary viewpoint. Another graph that I always like to show is this one of the predictions for 2026 average temperature increases. So as you can see, marked by the black line, you can see the classic curve in the representing the sharp rise in emissions. And then what is interesting is the line in red. Why? Because finally, this is the prediction for 2026. And we are supposed to, this year, to overshoot the 1.5 Paris Agreement scenario. This is a quite astonishing graph to me, because it shows that finally we are entering a very dangerous zone for both people and the climate system. With our work, we aim to answer one question that is central to our study. What keeps us stuck in preventing the climate overshoot? And why, if carbon intensity falls and the decarbonization progress increases, why we still increase cumulative carbon emissions? What is the drive? We started from one point, that is that CO2 emissions per capita are strongly correlated and positively correlated with GDP per capita. This trend increases faster than linearly. So this indicates that income levels are really linked and disproportionately between global north and global south, with cumulative carbon emissions. As you can see, the R-square test reveals a 0.855 level of correlation in between the two across the world. But this is not the focus of our work. Is actually debt. Why debt? Debt can be defined as a legal obligation to repay borrowed money, and represents, since all production and consumption is based on energy and materials, represents a claim on future energy and future economic output. So debt can be seen as a bet that the future energy availability will be enough to sustain future production and repay those claims. So we can see debt as a claim on the future. For this reason, I wish to present two graphs that represent the debt ratio to GDP in the US. At the moment, the total debt of US averages around 125% to GDP. Often, by financial analysts, this has been defined as the future financial crisis, because the projections show a trend that outpaces the levels of debt after the Second World War, as you can see from the graph. Where is this debt coming from, and where is it directed towards? As you can see, marked in the brown with the brown color, there is this social security part. What do you think is this social security referring to? Is defense, okay? So most of debt, around 1/3 of debt, goes towards defense. Our work, as I was presenting, aims to find and prove a causal chain in between GDP growth, material and energy throughput, that you can also refer to as GDP, and cumulative carbon emissions. We also aim to show that until debt will be allocated towards carbon-intensive investments in industries, the cumulative carbon emissions will always rise and will keep the trend and will outpace the trend that is the current one. So overall, for how debt is allocated now, it risks to locking economies into carbon-intensive, debt-dependent growth. Our methodology. So I started my career as a physicist. So for this reason, I collaborated with a group of physicists from ESPCI in Paris. They had a model that from statistical mechanics aimed to model bad hedging in uncertain environments. So it actually comes from a model that aims to predict the outcomes in horse races. For this specific context, we adapted it to take into account for debt. So we changed massively the model itself. In this model, capital evolves stochastically. So there are no previous assumptions on stability, as often EIMs have. Then debt accumulates with interest rate rho, and the emissions follow a Kaya-type relation. In this model, we analyze cumulative emissions to capture their path dependence, thanks to the stochasticity of the model itself. So the calibration phase is, for us, particularly important, also because it worked pretty well. And that was a pretty surprising fact for us. So in this graph, two graphs, you can see path-dependent intensities for 4 countries: US, China, Denmark, and France. As you can imagine, the best fit for our model was US, because material and energy throughput and consumption and production within the country are more or less equal. Okay, so as you can see, what is interesting, I would recommend to switch to the panel B panel in the right. There is, we can see the comparison in between cumulative carbon emissions with the predictions of our stochastic model. As you can see, there is a pretty good fit. And so this reveals that actually debt levels can make predictions, be used to make predictions on cumulative carbon emissions. This is the first time that such a model has been pursued. Another interesting fact, and what is relevant also for policymakers, is that we showed that an increased level of leverage still outpaces an increased decarbonization rate. So even if we can reduce carbon intensity, but still we have a high level of leverage, these will still make cumulative carbon emissions increase, and thus leading to overshoot. Another important point of our work is that this is not only a question for environmental risk, it's also a question for financial stability. Why? Because we found a threshold above which actually that's, yes, leads to short-term GDP gains, but at the same time, it increases long-term risk and cumulative emissions altogether, especially when debt grows faster than GDP. So there is a risk on the probability of solvency that decreases with both leverage and the payback time, as you can see from the graph. But still, a point we had after all this work was that still we had some uncertainties on carbon intensities. We wanted to see if our metric was solid and robust or not. So we did some plots. This was one of the plots that really catched our eye. Why? Because of this spike of carbon intensities that are defined as the ratio of emissions of a given year over GDP in the same given year. What is interesting is that we see a spike around 1990. What do you think is this spike? Where do you think is this spike coming from? Sorry? No. Yes. I didn't get. Yes, is the Gulf War of 1991, and this is precisely why these emissions, if you look at the carbon intensities all over the globe, come from Kuwait. Because during, I don't know if you're familiar with the Gulf War, but during the American offensive to Iraq, Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait. But before retreating from Kuwait, they gave fire to all almost 1,000 oil wells. These provoked a 2% increase in global carbon emissions. And why can you see this spike? Because carbon intensities are a ratio in between emissions and GDP. So in the moment you have a conflict, you both increase drastically the emissions. As you can imagine, emissions due to combustion can be really extremely high. And also they lasted almost 1 year because it was almost impossible to extinguish them. Then at the same time, you have a recession due to the conflict itself, the armed conflict itself. So of course, you can, due to these conflicts that are both EV for the environment and the economy, you can see spikes in the carbon intensities. So this shows that there is an inherent fragility of these indicators that are used as the main decarbonization indicators during times of polycrisis. Why is this relevant, you may ask? This is pertinent to 1991, not to the present, but actually something happened 2 months ago that is exactly the same mechanism. During the war in Middle East, in Iran, several oil wells were attacked and set fire. So this episode of Kuwait is descriptive and useful because it showcases that war-related impacts can distort the decarbonization indicators. And potentially, they can mislead policy interpretation because precisely these emissions, as I was presenting before, since are territorial, are related to Kuwait, not to Iraq or the US, but to Kuwait. That was the territory that actually hosted the war and wasn't responsible for any of the attacks. So this is interesting, both for a fairness perspective, but also for a robustness perspective in evaluating the decarbonization trajectories. So most importantly, and with this, I would like to conclude, net zero is not only an efficiency issue. It is also a credit allocation problem. And this is the message I would really like to pass. And also, first, annual intensity can hide the cumulative lock-in and the path dependency of growth. Second, that finance growth amplifies cumulative emissions, but also can amplify the financial risk over a certain threshold. Finally, climate policy must align financial leverage with decarbonization. This also implies the need for a robust assessment and robust indicators for decarbonization that can withstand polycrisis and are accepting that we are living in times of polycrisis, in which those precise indicators can be distorted. Finally, I'm glad to announce that the first paper on debt growth and the carbon lock-in was selected and shortlisted for a prize of the Ecological Economics Society. And you can already download the preprint if you want. I put the QR code. Is currently under review of Ecological Economics. The journal Ecological Economics will be published around September. As well, the paper on conflict and the Kuwait oil fires will be published for environmental research letters. So you can directly write to me if you're interested in the preprint. Finally, I would like to quickly, with my last few minutes, present you what is our current work that I am very proud to present because it's an idea that comes from these collaborators, this collective process between myself and our collaborators at the ESPCI. We are building a networked approach to decarbonization that is inspired by chemical reaction networks used to study origin of life. And we are using the same model to find the self-reinforcing feedback loops within the global economies. So as you can see, this is a feedback loop representative simple model of 3 industries that have both financial flows within and financial outputs. So is within a view of socioeconomic system as metabolisms. And if you're interested in collaborating or in the project itself, please reach out directly to me. It's interesting because finally, it's a way to also for policymakers to focus on decarbonization, not only of a single sector, but between the interaction on the interaction in between those sectors. So this is new, and I invite you to write to me if you're interested. Finally, I would really like to thank my collaborators at ESPCI who made this possible. And thanks to you for the attention and for being here so early in the morning. I'm very open to questions, so I let you the floor. Yes. I have a mic here if you wish.
Thank you. So my comment is with respect to the results with which I agree. I think it is interesting to see how debt-led economy can get in this lock-in dynamic. But I have I'm not sure that, I have just one question because I see around many conferences on sustainable finance and so on. So I'm just wondering whether this kind of question is debated in these conferences. So I do not know the literature. First, but second, with respect to the analytical treatment of the problem, I'm not sure that things are strong because you take the debt as a state variable in your problem, but it is it is a result of economic interaction. It is not something that is independent. It is not an independent. So I'm wondering whether this is good because you can take other things. What are the behavioral behind that variables? That's because if you take just variable, you may take another thing and you find good correlation with CO2 emissions and so on.
Of course. Thank you so much. Very pertinent questions. I would maybe start answering by the second one. So one major limitation of the model is that it takes into account public debt. So that's why, but I think that's why precisely is particularly relevant to conflict, because often is the state itself that invests in defense and war-related industries. So this is a major limitation, but is due to a lack of data due to private debt. Still, the model would fit, is the same, wouldn't change for a private debt. So this is important. The model still, you can see it with the calibration, fits very well with the data that we have throughout 20 years. This is one important point. I would say that, of course, the behavioral effects are very interesting to study. Of course, they are relevant, but not directly pertinent to our study. Of course, we aim to further develop it, and it was just the start. But at the same time, thanks for the first question. I think it's a question I pose myself as well. I have been to several conferences of sustainable finance for the European Commission as well. Actually, they are very interested in the topic because they face it. So that's why they're interested. Even if it's quite an anti-paradigmatic kind of point of view, it's relevant because we make quite precise predictions. So since it's a stochastic model and doesn't assume stability, it can make pretty good predictions that are relevant for them, also for policymaking. Still, I get invited by Banque de France, which is one of the leading institutions for sustainable finance. So I think these works can start to interest as well a more paradigmatic world of sustainable finance. Still, a very pertinent question. I also ask myself why they keep inviting me, but I guess that this can interest them. Also, mostly I would say that he is interesting to in the insurance world, I would say. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, I have a small question and then an action question. Okay, so the small question, I am just curious. When your story about COVID, you cannot stop the fire because I read a long time ago you put some dynamite and then it stopped the fire. So it's not true. You cannot stop it.
No.
No?
Actually, yes. I mean, I read many, after we realized that spike, I started to get very interested in the Gulf War. And I've read that it took almost 1 year. There was a massive intervention of firefighters they have specific kind of actions for this kind of fires. That's also why it took less to extinguish the one in Iran that happened recently. Still, the particulates that come and the pollution that comes and the environmental degradation that comes after this kind of fires is unavoidable and can have very long-lasting consequences as emissions that, as we know, can last up to 1,000 years. So.
Okay. And my second question, it will cost me money, but okay. If I give you money, Swiss, you can take it.
It's not useful.
No, but it's for my experiment. Okay.
Interesting.
Now you have that.
I have that.
And then, but you owe me.
Yes.
So, okay, so you have that, but I can call you and say,
Right.
by the way, give me back my 20 piece fine. First comment. So if you lend, there is a counterpart, and of course, if like Japan, the big debt, but the Japanese lend to the government, you may say, so what? It's not important. It's very different if you borrow. And then second question, sorry, but what do you do with that? If you go in Las Vegas, it's one thing. If you say, I had to buy a photovoltaic for my house, so what do you do with the money? I think it's important. If you invest in infrastructure, I say, okay, it's good.
Yes, exactly. A very pertinent question. I think is the precise endpoint of my presentation. That's why this is the first time I present to a more like economic kind of conference, but I really like to present this work that is more economics related to a climate audience, because I think we have so many climate policies and climate targets, but almost none of them account for a credit allocation. I think it's the main issue of our time. Where are we allocating our public debt? And I think, yes, precisely is the point of André. There is the need of a massive investment in infrastructure, transportation, electrification, and not just defense. I think, thanks for the point. I would spend it on a solar panel probably. But yes, still, I think this is private debt. And one of the main points as well is that there is a total decouplement in between what debt is and the over-financialization of our economy, for which our real economy is totally decoupled from finance. So the real economy is totally decoupled from the biophysical processes that on which it should rely upon and used to rely upon. There is a last question in the back. Thanks, Andrea.
So this may be my own understanding. So your premise is that the US fits your model particularly well. It fits the curve. And it's premised on quite large debt financing climate-intensive activity. Now, we're talking about polycrisis. So how we have a polycrisis sort of every hour or so at the moment. One of them in particular is the American policy, the American administration of, or let's say, countering what is going on. Otherwise, a trend from the 1970s, which was interestingly not in your graph, where we had petrodollarization. So the US can keep its economy nice and strong. It keeps a nice dollar despite massive debt because there's unlimited demand for US treasuries. That then keeps your currency nice and stable. I can purchase my imports for carbon-intensive activity offshored. Now you're seeing two forces. You're seeing de-dollarization. The wars in Venezuela and Iran can be linked to the de-dollarization, the weakening of the petrodollar status. The RMB now might take that position. So how robust is this to the idea that China and the US may now switch positions if demand for Chinese debt now grows? Will it perfectly switch, or are there other forces going on? And then similarly, will you instead see a drawdown of US debt? There's less demand, you're not able to finance it. The US president has wanted more reshoring, so the moving back of industry that was offshore back, carbon intensive, back to the US mainland. So you'll see a spike in their carbon intensity as well as a stock through time, but a drawdown in their debt, coupled as well with your other assignation, which is conflict. So the US spends a lot of its debt on militarization, and yet you're seeing increased nationalism. So you're seeing potentially a drawdown in US military spending. So how robust is your model to ironically, another polycrisis, to this ongoing one? Do you expect to see perhaps an inversion? Does it matter if the US and China invert? What does that say about your model? Does it matter? Is there some other factor in there that you expect to go to play on? And how robust do you anticipate this to be?
Thanks very much. Very interesting point. I would say that I can't properly say a prediction at the moment because it's a very complex question, what you asked. I was reading a report from a Wall Street financial analyst just yesterday about debt and the potential trajectory that this could take. The most probable trajectory that this financial analyst reported, and I can send you the reference if you wish, is a potential financial crisis starting in the US driven by that. And I can close on this. I think that's why we started this work, because we are very concerned with this kind of possibility.
You don't see it as a potentially an inversion, you see it as a collapse of the model, in which way?
Yes, at the same time, it's very interesting. Maybe I can ask you to put back the presentation. Is very pertinent to your question because the US and China are a very particular case. I have a graph in the appendix, but if you wish and we don't have time, I can speak directly. Yes.
But thank you. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. You need your